I wasn't a huge consumer of things other than like maybe books. And so podcasts just hit me in this way that just felt very like I had an ache, like a literal physical ache in my body of like wanting to dive in more and be involved in this community.
Podcast Junkies, episode 241. Welcome back. I'm your host, Harry Duran. If you are new, this is the first time you ever listened to this show. This is the one where we search out interesting voices in podcasting. We get them to kick back their heels and talk about their shows and whatever else is on their mind. In case you missed last week's episode, we had a great conversation with my namesake, Harry Morton. He's an entrepreneur, a podcaster, and the founder of Lower Street Media. It was really interesting because Harry and I both own a podcast production company, and obviously both named Harry, and it just speaks to this abundance mindset that I have and this idea of podcasting being that rising tide that's lifting all boats. And so it's just great to talk shop and hear how he's coping from a business perspective and what he's learned along the way. Episode 240, check that one out. This week I get to speak to Skye Pillsbury. Skye is a friend and someone that I was able to meet in person at Podcast Movement or Podfest. I get the conferences now mixed up now, being that it's been such a long time since I've been at an actual live conference. I definitely miss those. She's a former editor of Inside Podcasting newsletter, and she joins the show to share her origin story. Skye has a fascinating story of how she connected with Jonathan Goldstein, the host of Heavyweight, and was featured on episode 17. She talks about how she found her written voice and how she ended up becoming the editor of the Inside Podcasting newsletter. We naturally geek out on the power of the podcasting community, and because of Skye's experience at Inside Podcasting, we get to talk shop about the business of podcasting and how important preparation is for preparing our respective content. This episode is brought to you by Focusrite and specifically the Scarlett 2i2 sound card, one of my favorite go-to sound cards, something I use for each and every podcast recording. The 3G line is a go-to for all new podcasters. Find out more at podcastjunkies.com/Focusrite, and the link will be in the show notes as well. Skye's now getting ready for her next project, so we talk a little bit about that. And it's just one of those conversations where you feel like you're talking to an old friend. And I remember at the end realizing how quickly the time had gone by and how excited and honored I was that I was able to spend that time with Skye. She's really a genuine advocate for podcasting. She's such a sweetheart, and I think that comes across in this interview. So let's get to it. Let's not forget that this episode is also brought to you by Fullcast. Fullcast.co is the website. If you need help with any aspect of your show, from launch to production and marketing, we can help. Schedule a free chat at fullcast.co/chat15 about your existing or new show. Skye Pillsbury, welcome to Podcast Junkies.
Thank you so much for having me.
I remember asking you if we could figure this out, when we could make this happen. And I know that was an in-person conversation because we were in a hallway somewhere, I think at Podfest or Podcast Movement. And it seems like we take those little things for granted, but we all start to remember now, given that we're recording this in September 2020, the last time we were in in a big group like that.
I really, really miss being with people in this community. And I was thrilled when we talked about it that time. And then it just so happened that we connected again after the pandemic. And I think sort of in the wake of me leaving Inside Podcasting. And it actually felt weirdly like a good time to connect because, you know, everything is weird right now, you know, everything that we're dealing with. But my thoughts about podcasting are also, you know, my thoughts about my role in podcasting is starting to also change. And so this is really fun for me to be talking to you about it.
Yeah, this is the show where we just get to geek out on all things, chase down go down the podcasting rabbit holes with our podcasting peeps, which is why it's one of my favorite hours of the day.
Yeah.
Because I was having a discussion with Ariel Niesenblatt, and, you know, we've been friends a long time as well. And sometimes you think that at these conferences, you're going to be able to sit down and have a chat, but The more often you go, the more people you know, the more connections you have. There's just more people that you want to have those conversations with. So now for me, it's actually been, I'm using the podcast, leveraging the podcast and just saying, hey, I want to catch up with Skye, and better place to do it than on the show, because that's, we're all just talking about the podcasting world. So it's been helpful for me because, you just don't get that time in those conferences anymore.
You're exactly right. And maybe that's one of the reasons why I was especially excited to be here with you today, because I haven't, my second season of my podcast where I got to speak with people in the industry, and Ariel was on one of my post-show episodes. And that's just another example of the same thing, of connecting with someone. There's something about being with people that are just as excited about this as you are, which I don't get from my family, and they all like podcasts, but it's not the same kind of thing. And I have done some virtual events. I've attended some virtual podcast events, and those are great. And it's like holding me together, and it's great to just see the faces on the screen. But if you're being honest, it's not the same as being with people in person, and then having those, serendipitous, like you see someone at a party and you connect and whatever. Like, I just love all of that, and I can't wait for that to come back. Yes. Which is where the idea of this started. Yeah.
Yeah. So for the listener that may not be familiar with you, maybe wind the clock a little bit and tell us where and when you were when podcasting showed up on your radar.
Sure. So I have been a fan of podcasts for a really long time, and I had my day job, my career was actually as a publicist in the technology industry. And actually, I was aware of podcasts in some part because I was in the technology industry. And so, of course, that, podcasting, and especially in the early days, you had to be connected in some way in order to access them. And so I was aware of them, but they didn't, I'm sort of always embarrassed to admit this, but they did not come into full view until Serial, which is like, I'm always, feel like that's super uncool to admit that, but it is true.
It's true for a lot of people too, and whether they care to admit it or not. So
I know. And I talk to so many people now who've been podcasting like since, 2004. And I, that just, I wish that I had been doing it since that time. So I remember the phone call I got from my friend Emily, who told me about this podcast called Serial and helped me figure out how to listen to it. And I was doing a lot of driving at that time, so it was sort of perfect. And I dug into it. And then from there, sort of discovered a lot of other things. I was super in awe of the experiences that I was having in my ears. It felt really different than consuming any other kind of media. I'm actually not like a huge TV watcher. I end up watching a lot because my husband loves TV. He's sort of turned me into a convert. But like left to my own devices, I wasn't a huge consumer of things other than like maybe books. And so podcasts just hit me in this way that just felt very like I had an ache, like a literal physical ache in my body of like wanting to dive in more and be involved in this community. But I had no experience, being, on that, making, any kind of audio or, I had been a publicist, so I was actually in the media world in that way, but it wasn't the same. And so my first actual taste of what podcasts were about was I was an avid listener of Heavyweight. Probably, I mean, people who are familiar with me or read my newsletter know about this, but so I'll say it quickly. But I love that show. It's a show about how people, go back to a moment in their past and try to sort of figure it out later on in life. And I had a moment like that in my own life. And so I pitched Heavyweight. I was a publicist, so this came in handy. And I pitched them, and they ended up making, an episode about my experience. Jonathan, the host, Jonathan Goldstein, shouts to him, flew out to San Francisco from Brooklyn. I live in the Bay Area, and we recorded, and I got to see his recording equipment, and I got to sort of get a sense during that whole experience also with Kalila Holt, who was the producer on that. I got a sense of like, just from the questions they were asking me or just in the things that they needed to know, or like they wanted to know like, what is in my son's room? Because he's a character in that story. And I just started to like figure out like, how do you put this kind of very complicated story together? And they did a masterful job with my story, I feel. And so that was sort of my first taste. And then I was reading a lot of newsletters. Like I didn't have any reason to be reading these newsletters other than this bizarre passion I had developed around audio. And one of the newsletters that I subscribed to, which was sort of a non-bylined newsletter. It was, really just here's the the news of the day was Inside Podcasting. And I don't know how I found it. I was also subscribing to Hot Pod and other newsletters. And they one day said, we're looking for a writer for this newsletter. And I threw my hat into the ring, and miraculously, like, they gave me the job. I was totally learning as I went, like, I was so passionate about it that made up, I think, for a lot of my, my newness, like I didn't, with every industry, and I know this just from being in technology PR and having clients sort of all over the map, like that was part of my job then, was to like, dive really deep into an idea and then figure out how to explain it to people. So in a way, this job was in a way perfect for me. And I felt like I was getting paid to learn more. And so I just loved it.
Well, you're coming at it from a place of genuine, natural curiosity for something that you've like recently discovered and you're super passionate about. And so you're sort of taking the reader, I imagine in those early newsletters, like on a journey with you and saying, I just discovered this, and that enthusiasm comes through in your writing and your energy. And so I think it just makes for more compelling content.
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. There were definitely moments when I was, just so delighted about something that I could share with my readers, because my readers were a mix of podcasters and fans like me. And so for every newsletter, there's going to be some people who already know what I'm talking about, but there's going to be a lot more people probably who don't. And so, yeah, it was this sort of like, I kind of felt like Alice in Wonderland, like, going down the rabbit hole and like discovering things and like, figuring it out. And so I do hope that came through. And then, over time, I think I got more familiar with the industry and I developed my own, opinions about things, which, I tried not to always infuse that, but I think some amount of personality is good. And I feel like it was helpful in that I wanted to interact with my readers. I wanted to know what they thought. And I think that hopefully came through in the way that I would write about things, was very like, here's what I think. Like, what do you think? And I love the fact that people would actually respond. So that was one of the things I loved most.
Was writing a regular newsletter something you had done previously, or
no?
And so how did you start to find your written voice? And, how did you start to think about how you were going to be putting content together? Because there's no shortage of obviously news about podcasting, and you don't want to sound like every other newsletter out there as well. So I'm wondering, I imagine there's listeners that are interested or have started their own newsletters, and it's its own world, with Substack, making a bigger splash now, and everyone that's leaving or getting fired from other jobs now having to start their own stuff. And you hear about New York Times writers now starting newsletters. So it's an interesting skill to develop. Yeah. And so I'm wondering about what that was like for you.
It's funny. I don't think maybe I've been asked that question, but I don't think that I knew that I would have a voice. And that's the truth. Like when I started it, it was just like, okay, I'm just trying to like do this well. And, I'm just going to try to give them something interesting. When I was, for the first 18 months, I was writing it every day, 5 days a week. And so I was just trying to do a good job. But then I did notice that when I would put something sort of funny, or, I mean, I hate to say it, but like maybe a little bit snarky, but like that was based in real, belief on my part or emotion or something, that I would get a really good response from people. And I think Jason Calacanis, who owns Inside.com, which is what Inside Podcasting, the newsletter that I wrote, was part of, they produce a whole bunch of newsletters on all different topics. And I think he was noticing that too. Like my newsletter was increasing in subscribers, at a pretty quick pace. And he started really, and shouts to him for this, he started really supporting that, like wanting me to have my own voice, like, make it personal. Like, we didn't, I did, when I started, there was no like, hi readers at the top of it. Like towards the end, I would almost always have a little note at the top and I would sign it for me, because Jason was like, let's start doing that with every issue so that people are understanding they're getting they're getting a particular voice. Yeah. And he really, you'd think almost that they wouldn't want that, like that then they would think, oh, you're going to become too big for your britches or something.
Or they could just slot in someone else, when it didn't work out. Yeah.
Right. I mean, he really wanted me to build a brand around who I was. And that wasn't how I had gone into it. But, it was fun for me to then start having people write to me and say, hey, what's your opinion about this? Or people would just reach out, even if it wasn't about the newsletter. And so, I don't know how I found it, but I did find it. Like, I think it's just one of those things that like, you don't really know that you have a voice until you're already there. And then you're suddenly like, okay, like, certain issues would make me extremely, passionate. And I suddenly was moved to do like some original reporting, which the inside newsletters never do. And so, there was some stuff that came out with iHeartMedia, and they were sort of like always calling themselves first at everything, and their awards show is a great example of that. But they had done this a number of times, and I had written about it a number of times, and finally I just got sick of it and was irritated and wanted to talk to them about it, and did end up speaking to someone from there, and did some reporting on that issue. And that was honestly when I was having the most fun, was when I had, when I saw something that, it could be something that I saw as an injustice, or as someone sort of overstepping or not understanding our industry and acting like they did. Luminary is another good example of that. But but I also really enjoyed, I started also doing just interviews with people who were like being vocal on Twitter about an issue, or like in the case of Avery Trufelman, she announced on Twitter that she was leaving her podcast. And, I just reached out to her, was like, I want to know where you're going, and got the opportunity to interview her way before I was allowed to publish it, and had it ready to go once she announced. And that was really fun for me too. So, just figuring out like what's going on in the industry, and, so it's not all like I'm trying to like just like throw companies under the bus. It's also just me being curious about creators and what they're doing. And that's still like an interest of mine. And that's also why I started the podcast. Yeah.
Yeah. So what's interesting is what you were describing in terms of like the experience you had, and that concept of finding your voice. It's similar to when people start a podcast. I always say you could have 5 different people hosting the same exact show with the same exact name, and you would end up with 5 different shows, because people inevitably are going to bring in like their experiences and their tone and their view on life. And it seems like that's what started to happen with you, because it's almost like your personality could not come up. For anyone that's met you would probably agree as well. They're like, oh, it's just a matter of time before we get to see who Skye really is. And I think that's how a lot of people in the podcast community, I think, became aware of you and started. And I think the fact that you were taking that initiative to sort of poke holes and stuff, because as you mentioned, there's a lot of fluff and BS and just weird stuff happening, especially when you're speaking to some of the people who have been doing this for years, and they're like, well, not first ever, and you weren't all that sort of stuff is interesting.
I was really, really fortunate in that way, because, and I will credit the She Podcasts. No, it wasn't She Podcasts. It was Outlier. I'm sorry.
Oh,
She Podcasts too, but it was Outlier a couple years back. I was already writing the newsletter, but I went to Outlier in Austin, and it was a really, small but mighty group of podcast people, or people who are aspiring to make podcasts. And I don't know how this happened. I feel like we had become friends on Twitter, but Jessica Kupferman, huge shout out to Jessica.
Yeah.
I keep shouting people out. I've never done that on a podcast before, but I'm feeling
You can do it on a podcast about podcasting. That's the best part. I call it the podcast drinking game.
Exactly. I had the very good fortune to meet her, and like we had a plan to meet each other because we had somehow been interacting. And she was like my Sherpa. Like we were at this podcasting festival, and she was just introducing me to all sorts of people who were there. And, a lot of people who were there were people who had been podcasting in fact, that's where I met Evo Terra, who's, who produced the podcast I ended up making, or the second season of it. And I just met so many people, just being around them, the people who had been around podcasting for so long, helped me understand the history. And so that I had a little bit of an insider's view from people who'd been doing it long enough, so that I wasn't just coming in cold as a hired gun to write this newsletter. I was doing a lot of research in the beginning, but then I really learned a lot from that festival, I'm on the board there now. I think maybe, are you too? I don't know.
Yeah. My grandfather did at some point.
Yeah, right. So anyway, that's a lot of the reason why that really helped me in my writing, sort of understand what had gone on before, so that I wasn't just like taking, what people said to me, from press releases, and taking that for granted, taking that at its word, I guess I would say.
Yeah, especially people that have put in the time. And I was grateful enough. And I think that was part of my thought process, because the inspiration for Podcast Junkies came from Inside the Actor Studio, if you remember that TV show.
Yes, 100%.
And so James Lipton would interview these actors, and you always see them on the screen, and you're like, oh, whatever. But then you get to see them actually like talk about something like personal, like, and you're like, oh, okay, they're human beings, they're real people. So
Yes, I love that show.
that was kind of like the thought process. Because I studied acting for like 3 years, and I was like, and that's how I was like a big fan of the show when I was in New York. So.
Oh, I didn't know that you studied acting.
And the actual idea for Podcast Junkies came because I was working on a mobile app for electronic music because I grew up DJing vinyl turntable.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Yeah, so I was like just fascinated with that, and then I was like, oh, I was gonna start a podcast to interview DJs originally, but then
That's
I
a great
realized,
idea.
but it was so at that time it would have been so hard to track them all down. Like I was like, oh, they're globetrotting DJs because the ones that I like, they're playing in like Spain and like Berlin,
Yeah.
and so I shelved that when I went to New Media Expo in 2014 January, and it was bloggers, YouTubers, and podcasters, and Pat Flynn was speaking, Amy Porterfield, Scott Stratton, and I was like, oh, interesting, and then. Came back, the idea of Podcast Junkies popped up. And then I started like the old schoolers. I asked Elsie to come on, Jessica,
Nice.
Gary Leland, Rob Walsh, Daniel J. Lewis, like all these people.
You got that's an all-star team right there.
Dave Jackson and Ray Ortega, just as like the old schoolers, just like schooling me, like, because I was like, okay,
that's awesome.
So tell me how it works. So then later, when other folks would come in or people would see stuff, you could just see the old schoolers being like, just watching everyone coming in. And then I'm interested in your thoughts on this, but how you feel about the podcasting community itself, because it's interesting because we're like our own family. And obviously, there's the procaster, what people call the procasters, and then the indies, and we could probably, that could be a whole separate discussion. But I was wondering, like, if you started to notice that or see that or sense that about, that was something different about podcasters and the community of folks that we all hang out with.
Yes, I will answer that. And then after that, I have a question I want to ask you.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to let you get away. But, that's a really great question. I think that there are a lot of like sub communities within podcasting. I think that we saw that really clearly when the Podcast Academy was first announced. And there was this whole group of people who felt that the representation of the people who had been there at the very beginning didn't exist. And now they've, I think they've done some work to address that. But, and I no need to get mired in that controversy, but that really brought to the fore. I remember seeing Elsie Escobar. And by the way, for any listener who doesn't know, like Elsie and Jessica, who I mentioned, are the founders of She Podcast, which is a huge, huge community on Facebook. And they do a conference, and they're amazing.
I always joke that I should listeners should be playing podcaster bingo during my episodes because you
who do you hit? Yeah. That's a great idea. Then someone wins at the end.
Yeah.
So now I forgot what I was about to say. Hold on. Oh, the community. So I remember seeing Elsie and Hernan Lopez, who is still the head of Wondery, although he's dealing with an issue himself. But I remember seeing, he was the one who I think thought or, promoted the idea in the beginning of the podcast community. And I remember him and Elsie, I remember reading with such fascination their back and forth on Twitter.
On Twitter, yeah. That was
and then they eventually spoke. I was actually texting with both of them, like so curious about because Hernan and I had become friends through the newsletter, and Elsie and I had known for a while and had been like just a wonderful mentor in a way to me. And it was so great because it was like the two different factions, like Wondery coming in, big money company, like they're doing almost all true crime, like sort of sensational page turning, kind of stuff that will sell a lot and then turn into TV. And Elsie being this very like indie, person, like doesn't even have Wi-Fi in her house, like kind of person. And it was so great to see that happen and to see them actually come to then they had a phone call. So anyway, in a way, that's a long way of answering your question, is that just that I'm very aware that there are a lot of different communities. And of course, like with all the new podcasters coming in, like that's a whole thing. Like I've had so many, as I'm sure you do, like so many friends reach out to me. Someone reached out to me today saying, can you talk to my friend? She's going to start a podcast,
Yeah.
So, that happens all the time now. And that's a whole new generation of people. And what are they going to know about it? And how are they going to, it's a fascinating situation or industry. I shouldn't say situation. It's a fascinating industry that we are in. Yeah. But I have a question for you, which is just because we both, for my podcast, which ran for 2 seasons, I interviewed creators and, podcast creators, and you do that as well. And I have to imagine that for you, a lot of those people that you were talking to were, I don't know if heroes of yours is too strong of a word, but definitely people, as you said, were sort of like, you were learning from them, they were mentoring you. And a lot of the people that I've interviewed have been like, some of the people I've been amazed by, just in terms of their work. And I'm curious, just, interviewer to interviewer, because it is such an art if you are doing it well. Like whether you would get nervous about interviewing people, if you did, do you still? How do you prep for interviews? I'm curious about all that stuff.
It's funny. I used to do more prep, but now I think the prep comes from me in the meeting the person before at and typically they would be at conferences. Best place to get a podcaster is at a podcasting conference. So,
yep.
But then inevitably, whether it's Podcast Movement or Podfest or Outlier, I would inevitably meet a whole new round of folks, and we would spend maybe the next 2 or 3 days at the bar and hanging out, and just okay, cool. And I'm like, all right, let's pick up this discussion on the show, because then I would come back with I want to speak, I want to have another follow-up conversation in my mind, basically with these cool podcasters I just met. So I would have another 10 or 15 candidates to just always saying, hey, let's come on, and rarely do I do just cold, I've never spoken to the person before. And if I do, that's when someone's reached out to me, a PR company or someone. They find me through the website. And occasionally, I'll have a cold email from someone and I'll just be like, oh, yeah, sure. Come on the show.
That's great. That's
great.
And
then it's and they come on and we have a fantastic conversation. I just had a conversation with Tyler Martin. Have a Blessed Gay is his podcast.
Oh, I love that name. That's great.
And it's like a mix between spirituality, LGBTQ, and it's just I just saw the artwork. His email was high vibe, and I was like immediately I was like, yes, sure, come on, let's go. And then
I really am jealous of that, because so one thing that I have to confess is that I don't know how to produce a podcast by myself yet. And so,
I know a guy.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. So, I was lucky enough, obviously, to be in an industry where it was, I could just throw a rock and hit someone who could help me.
Yeah.
So I did that. But one of my, you have the ability to just say, okay, yeah, let's just do it.
Yeah.
For me, I would be in that place if I felt like I could just turn on a dime on my own and just do it, And so can you tell me, when you're producing it by yourself, because I've always outsourced sort of the software end of it, the production, I'm still doing the editing, but the paper edit, how much time does it take you to turn that around? At this point, you've been doing it for so long, I'm sure it's super easy. How much do you edit your podcast? How long does it take you?
So when I got started, I did everything myself. And I came from, so interesting enough, that DJ background led to, I had taken classes in mastering and electronic music production. So when I first got started, I was using a tool called Ableton Live to edit, which is overkill. It's I always say it's like driving a Ferrari to the grocery store. It's way too much. So now I use Hindenburg. But I mean, this is what we do. My company, Fullcast, we produce shows for businesses, and I have a team now, so now they produce my show. So basically but I edit, and quite honestly, very, very little edits on these conversations. And because they're podcasts where I talk to other podcasters and we go through the reality of, the recording environments we're in and stuff, most of the time I leave in the stuff with the interruptions, and I'm like, oh, my dog jumped into my lap. I'm like, okay, what's his name? And it's now he's part of the show. And, because it's sort of podcasters know,
yes.
That's the reality of life. And so just very minimal now editing. So it's mostly the whole, hour-long conversation typically makes its way there. And then I just do a quick intro and outro, and then we put it into our rotation for marketing.
Has your podcast been a good way for you to find business? I would imagine that's part of the funnel for you, but I don't actually know. I've never asked you.
Yeah, not in the beginning. And it's so interesting, this is inside baseball for you, the listener, when you get a podcast host, two podcast hosts talking together, inevitably you're just
sorry, not sorry.
Sorry, not sorry. No, because I do it too. I'm on shows and I want to ask a question, and
I
I'm
know.
just
You can edit this out if you want.
No. I love this. But this is why I won't, because it's beautiful, because I love how this is happening. So, I'm sorry, what were you asking me?
I was just curious if it was a funnel for you for business.
Yes.
If that's been successful.
In the beginning, I didn't really have anything to sell. So on the show itself, I'm just like, oh no, this is just me doing the show. But I learned a lot. It was like how to every single aspect of the show, setup, launch, marketing, promo. I bought yellow t-shirts and I would go to Podcast Movement, hand them out. And so now like I'm known for that. And so just kept trying different ideas. And so when I hired a business coach, and it's a mastermind that I'm still part of called Black Belt, I was around all these like 6-figure, 7-figure business owners, and I was blown away. Like Jim Rohn, he's an inspirational speaker. He's like trained Tony Robbins. He says you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. And I was just like, oh, like I was coming from like a 9-to-5 world because I was like almost 20 years in corporate. And I was just like, wait, like entrepreneurism, like starting your own company, 6-figure, 7-figure businesses, remote teams. Like I was just like in digital Narnia. I was just like, whoa, like this is crazy. And so, but I realized like I wanted to create an offering for that caliber of people. Like, because that at the time he was like a $1,500 a month coach. And I was like, oh, okay, the people that can pay him are the people that I want to target with my offer. So we built a full service done for you offering that, what we say is we help business owners focus on their genius. And and then we take care of everything else that's not their genius, which is editing, which is graphics, which is show notes. Like, ideal world, you do the Howard Stern, you show up, you speak, and then you leave. And then like everything else just magically happens.
Right.
So just been over time, but that's helpful for me because now when I talk to prospects, I'm like, I've been doing this for 6+ years. Like I've had 235 episodes, hour-long interviews. So I can, I know a thing or two about, best practices for having an effective interview. So that helps. And then now I do mention like the show is produced by Fullcast in the outros on Podcast Junkies. So I think it's not a direct because the audiences are a little different, but I do have like Focusrite is a sponsor on the Podcast Junkies for now. So there's a little bit of
crossover
recognition because it's super, it's a podcast where I talk to podcasters. So naturally Shure's been a sponsor in the past as well in podcasting conferences. But I
love to talk to anyone who's making a living in podcasting. You know what I mean? Like it can be hard out there, as they say.
And everybody, all you need to do is listen to Pod News, and there's like 10 new companies with the word pod or cast in them, like starting. And
I know it's so true. It's overwhelming.
I'm keeping track of them for a project I'm working on, and I'm almost at 400. So,
really?
Yeah. It's just fascinating ecosystem. But I think there's room for growth, and there's room for, if you're offering something, I always have an abundance mindset. Like I talk to other podcast producers. I'm just like, I actually interviewed one for the show whose name is Harry as well. Harry Morton from Lower Street Media. And we just had shoot the shit, talk about podcasting. So I think it's, as long as you realize that there's a lot out there, and if we could all do our best to sort of, make sure we're making, doing what we can so that those new podcasts that are produced don't sound like shit.
Yeah. I've actually been amazed. I'm on a list. As I said, I live in the Bay Area, and I'm on a list of like radio people in the Bay Area. And, like one of those, what is it called? Like you get emails every week, like whatever. It's a listserv
like
type thing. Yeah.
Okay.
No, it's like a listserv, and you join it on whatever. I don't even know, can't remember what service, some sort of Google group service maybe. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. But the point I wanted to make is that I'm actually amazed at how many people are looking for help with editing, with, doing a tape sync, with whatever it is. Like I have often thought, because I actually have enjoyed the type of editing that I'm doing. Like I'm pretty good at like being painstaking about my editing, and I kind of get nerdy about it. And I've often wondered, like, I have considered myself like, is that a direction I should go? Like right now in my career, I'm sort of trying to figure out like what is going to be next, because I did have to leave Inside, and what's happening next for me. And now there's like not festivals, but events specific just to like podcast editors or every particular role, right?
Yeah. There's going to be a podcast newsletter editor conference.
Yes, exactly. It's all happening out there for sure.
Did you ever count them? Because at one point I was losing track of how many podcast newsletters there were.
No, there's so many. Hopefully most of them do serve different purposes, but there was always friendly competition between, my newsletter and Pod News, because when I was doing the news thing, it really was like, you would get a lot of overlap if you were subscribing to Pod News and Inside Podcasting. Then like my format really kind of changed quite a bit, in part because it needed to, because during COVID, I couldn't follow the news as closely as I was
Yeah.
before. So I started doing more evergreen type stuff. And I'm sure that James was happy about that.
Yeah.
But of course, I religiously read all the newsletters myself still, as I always have.
Yeah, the ones that come to mind, Bellow Collective. I know Jonathan Bailey Strong has one out of New York City.
Yes.
Which is a good one. And then the Podcast Business Journal.
Podcast Business Journal. I get that one too. Yeah. I get Lauren. Oh, what's wrong with me? I'm blanking on her last name. She has one called like Podcast that's really great.
Okay.
That's more of a discovery, like discover great podcast.
Oh, yeah.
Less industry, more like,
Sure.
and Paul Kondo has
Paul
Podcast
Kondo,
Gumbo.
that's right.
There's so many recommendation, newsletters as well.
Yeah.
And I try to read them all. There's Podcast Business Daily, which is actually, I think it's called Podcast Business Daily or Podcast Daily News. Maybe it's Podcast Daily News, but that is produced by iHeartMedia, and you will never see their name on the newsletter, which is
That's
just
the world's
another
first
thing that
podcast
super
newsletter. Did you know that?
Bugs me. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. They have one for podcast and radio, and it's both not branded as iHeart, which
That's
just
funny.
bothers me.
So you mentioned you had finished up your work at Inside.
Yes.
So what happened to the extent that you can talk about the transition and then the time off and then where your head's at now?
Absolutely. So I'll first just say I'm super grateful to Inside.com and Jason. He's kind of a piece of work who, which anyone who knows him knows that that's the case, including him. But, I came to I had a good relationship with him and I felt like he really supported me, as I said earlier. And writing that newsletter opened so many doors. I mean, it was the perfect way for me to enter this industry because I got to learn, I got to meet people, and I got to, I really feel like it was the entry door for me to so many other things and people. And so I'm super grateful. What happened there was, I had started to think about leaving, when the pandemic first hit and school was at home. I have 2 kids and one of them has learning differences. And I knew that it was helpful for me to be with her as much as possible. And so actually at that time, I almost quit then, but they talked me into staying. And that's when I started changing my format to more of I did sort of a crowdsourced thing where I would either interview people for it or I would ask a question and people would send in their own stories, their own answers, pictures of where they record or whatever. And that basically helped me survive that time because it was pretty much all hands on deck with remote school.
Yeah.
And then, of course, summer hit. And meanwhile, this is something I haven't spoken about a lot, but I feel comfortable talking about it now. Jason was really pushing on me to make that newsletter to put it behind a paywall. And I just did not think that my readers were going to have extra money to do that. Like a lot of his other newsletters, just for people who aren't familiar with his company, are like Inside Business, Inside Dev, like software development, Inside AI. These topics where, if you're in artificial intelligence, like maybe you have to read the news every morning in order to sound smart in that meeting. And you're going to you have the resources either from your company or yourself to pay the money to, get this newsletter every day. But, I just know from being in podcasting that a lot of podcasters don't have a whole lot of extra income and, they're working at a deficit. So many of them, yes, there were many CEOs and, the heads of, as I said, Hernan Lopez is an example of someone who definitely would have had the money to pay, but lots of people didn't. I'd say the majority of my readers probably
Luminary would have paid.
Luminary would have paid, yes, for sure. So, I just felt like I was going to lose a lot of my readership. And I did not start doing that to write for a small amount of people, call it my ego or whatever. But like beyond that, I just was, as I said before, like really enjoying the interaction with readers. And so I held him off for months. I held him off until I gave notice. And I think they will, from what I understand, it will eventually go that direction. I don't know the timing. They have a new writer who is great, but she still is, I think, building her relationship with the audience. And so maybe they'll now hold off on doing that and let her build more of a relationship with the new readers. But I just didn't want to know. I told my mom at one point, I was like, Jason wants me to put this behind a paywall. And she was like, well, you're going to have to quit. She knew what was in my mind, that I wouldn't want to do that. So, and then I knew that remote school was coming back. And so it just seemed like the second season of my podcast for them was ending at the end of August. It seemed like the perfect time to leave. And so I'm still figuring out, in answer to your second question, I'm still figuring out the next step, but I think that there is a high likelihood that there will be yet another newsletter to add to your email boxes, and it will be owned by me, and that will be nice because I don't own any part of what I produced or created for Inside. I don't own anybody's email address. I don't own any content. I don't own any part of the podcast, etc. So it will be nice to have that for myself. I think I would love to get to a point where I was also doing a podcast, but that's definitely secondary. First thing for me is to make sure that my life and school and COVID and pandemic is stable enough to add that in addition to writing. In the meantime, I'm doing some freelance writing. I have a couple things I'm working on for people who've approached me that's sort of, keeping the lights on. But, I'm also, as I said, like I'm also in this place and I feel very lucky because to be in this position, but I am able to think about, do I want to do something not completely different? It would definitely be in podcasting, but do I want to get trained to be an editor? Do I want to, go down a different rabbit hole in this industry? Yeah. And so that's also in the back of my mind. And it's been nice. A lot of people sort of, I tweeted about this and I have had a lot of lovely people reach out. And so I've had some informational conversations with people. And so I'm kind of in this place of just feeling open, but I miss writing and I miss being part of the conversation or at least conveying the conversation. Yeah. And it will be a different spin. It's not going to be, I'm not going to copy Inside podcasting. I have already an idea of sort of how it's going to be different, but I'm not quite ready to talk about it yet.
That's exciting. And I will make room for one more newsletter.
Oh, thank you, Harry. I appreciate that. I mean, it's this funny thing where you quit when you've been someone that people know, to some extent, it is this weird thing where you quit and then, I sort of feel a little bit like, is it echoey in here? Like, like a little bit like, do I exist? Like,
you're like not in the conversation anymore.
No, I'm really
like,
not.
Because we're not going to conferences either.
Exactly.
You feel that's part of it as well. So
100%. So, I miss that. I really loved that about my job and I want to do that. But there's also that insecurity of like, will people subscribe to another newsletter or will people, be interested in whatever work I produce next? Like, I still don't know the answer to that question, but I would feel pretty lame if I didn't at least try. I got to try.
What's interesting is that the default for you, and I imagine it's for me if I have to make decisions like this down the line, but for you, it's not a question of whether it's going to be in the world of podcasting, right?
No, it's not a question.
So that's interesting because I think, I don't spend a lot of time on this, but you're making me think about this a little bit. Like, 6 years ago, like nobody knew who I was and I really didn't know who anybody was. And I didn't even know about podcasting probably.
Right.
So the fact that this is like my life now and I have a show and it's part of the reason why I was just like, oh, I gotta keep the show up so I can talk to people to see what's going on. But, do
you have a pull in any other direction or have you, when you sort of, you were telling the story of how you sort of pivoted to this. Yeah. Has it felt like, oh, this is where I'm supposed to be, or have you had other thoughts?
No, yeah. I mean, I can't, when you think about like what you would want to do, like my major goal right now is just like growing and scaling the agency and just because I'm afraid to do it. And so like, and I know it'll be a lot of work. And I'm working with a good scaling coach by the name of Alex Sharfin, who's taken companies to like $100 million. So there's different phases depending where you are in your company. So that's the next challenge for me. But, when I think about what I would like to be doing if, money wasn't an option. And I think it's always something related because I always have podcast ideas.
Yes.
I started a whole new show in the vertical farming industry.
What?
I've
been
doing
know that.
I just finished up the first. It's called the Vertical Farming Podcast.
Is that obviously that's something else you're passionate about?
Well, it's interesting because I read Peter Diamandis' book Abundance, which is a fascinating book about the future. And there was a chapter on vertical farming. And then in my agency, I was like, I wonder if I could create my own client. So basically, I started reaching out to CEOs and founders of vertical farming companies, started interviewing them. And I'm like, yeah, I'm just really curious and I want to just learn a lot about the industry. And then that stair steps into like other CEOs. And then eventually one of the companies, Intelligent Growth Solutions, they sponsored my whole season before I even published an episode.
Oh my God. Harry, that's amazing.
Yeah, so it was really interesting because then I did some research. I'm like, vertical farming is a $14 billion industry by 2026. There's no shortage. And even with what happened with COVID now, the awareness of having local access to your food, fresh food, is even more top of mind. So
it's totally relevant.
I was interviewing the CEO of IGS And he was the first interview I had after COVID. So this was like mid-March, and he's in Scotland in his home, and
What?
I'm in Minneapolis, and I'm doing like a Squadcast interview with him for like an hour.
I cannot believe how creative that was for you to did you have that in the back of your mind? Like, okay, I'm going to talk to, I mean, you went from it sort of like the cart before the horse, which I love. And it totally worked out. Like, were you like, whoa, I'm spending all this time.
Well, I'm thinking who has money, or how are people spending their marketing dollars and their marketing budgets?
Always a good question to ask.
Yeah. And so like what industries are blowing up? So obviously anything like future AI stuff, I imagine nanotechnologies. I could probably think of like 20 or 30 other industries where if you do enough research, quantum computing or something like this.
Yeah,
like
yeah.
Specific, and the more niche, the better. So this is not just ag tech, which is all technology related to agriculture, but it's indoor ag tech, which is specifically vertical farming. And I was like, and then this is what we tell clients, like, don't get fancy with the name, just SEO the hell out of it. Like my partner's a photographer, Natalie, the photographer, and we started to help her with a podcast, and she trains other photographers how to start a photography business. So we called it Photo Business Help. That's the name of the show.
That's perfect, right? That's
and then I have
what you need.
A new client, Richard Smith, who's founded a company called Trade Stops, and which he eventually sold. He's starting a new show, talk to people about investing. It's called Understanding Investing. Like, so when I started the vertical farming podcast, I'm like, it's just going to call it what it is.
Yeah.
Because I need as many eyeballs on that as possible.
Did you go and look and see, like, are there other podcasts about this? Like,
yeah, there were a couple.
But nothing major. You found one of those niches. Oh, good job. That's what everyone should be doing.
So that was just like a kind of like a thought experiment, just like, oh, I wonder if I could sort of create my own client. And now we're, once you get the first season sponsor, then it's a little easier to have other conversations with folks, and you just price it high enough, because I was having conversations with them, and this is just as COVID hit, and they're like, oh, we're not going to a conference. And I was like, well, how much do you normally spend on these booths? And they're like, $10,000 or $20,000. It's like, okay, that just basically price anchors where I can offer my stuff, because as long as it's less than that, for, then they'll see it as value. And then you just over deliver, you just do it, whatever you can to knock it out of the park for that whole season. So, and I've had the CEO back on for a second round, and he really enjoyed the interview. He's like, yeah, my team liked it a lot. So
oh my gosh, I'm really impressed with that.
Yeah,
I've not heard a story like that, and I've heard a lot of stories. So I don't know, that's impressive.
Yeah, so I think just back to staying within like the industry, because it just feels like there's so much potential. And this is another industry itself, right? Podcasting itself, and we all want to figure out like where we can play and what impact we can have, and also just the people that do have a voice and are good at it. In the community, we know who they are, and I know that people have resonated with your tone and with your writing when you took over the Inside Podcasting newsletter. So definitely want to congratulate you on that.
I take that as a huge, huge compliment, and I don't take it for granted. I know that I was really lucky to be in that place, and I hope that I can, continue to do some work in that area. One other thing that I would love at someday, this is nowhere obviously in the future, but is to find a way to be in this industry and work with others, like be part of a team. That's one thing I really did miss, actually, when I was. One downside of working for Inside is it's very, very much of a solo thing. Everyone's remote even before the pandemic, and you're writing on your own, and the podcast was almost entirely, a solo project with some outsourcing, but very much of like, it wouldn't have happened without me just putting it all, making it all happen on my own. And I do miss, that's one thing I miss about being in the PR world, is that I loved working at agencies, because you're surrounded with other people who think like you, hopefully, if you're working at the right place, and you're constantly like bouncing story ideas off of them for your clients, or like trying to figure out like how you can fit into how this client, what can they have to say about this conversation? You're having brainstorming sessions about that. And I loved that part of that job. I don't want that job anymore, not in technology PR, but I do miss sort of the mind meld of working with other people. So that's a longer term goal. I would love to work with others. Yeah. So we'll see if that happens.
And I think the opportunities will present itself. The industry keeps growing, and it's maturing, I think, is the word that probably makes more sense, because it's in like teenager years, maybe, I would think, if you think about 2006, I guess, as the starting point. So now, Adam Curry jumping back in the fray with the directory. That's the open source directory project. So it's interesting. It's a little bit of like, as much as the push to corporate, if you want to use the Star Wars analogy, like the evil empire moving in.
Yes.
And so the rebels sort of fighting back the indie podcasters. I think that's fun to watch.
I love a Star Wars metaphor anytime I can get it.
Couple questions as we wrap up. I feel like with some of these conversations, I always think about the Joe Rogan model, and I want to do like 2 hours after dark. So like we would stop this, there would be an hour for the episode, and then it's just me and you like literally like shooting the shit for like another just 2 hours.
Someday.
Yeah.
You can get there.
Then it's the super deep meta podcast about podcasting.
That's right.
But then
I'm all about that.
But then the back room, like what they really talk about, like when the
after the light goes off, after the when we're having our post interview drink, what are we talking about then?
Exactly. So that's in the works. What's something you've changed your mind about recently?
Oh, I've heard you ask people this question, and I can't believe I didn't think of an answer before I came on here. What's something I've changed my mind about recently? Whoa. That's hard because there's so many ways these days in which our minds get solidified, like in the national discourse, of things. We're such a polarized place. Oh, actually, I have a good example, and it's related to podcasts.
Nice.
So I don't know if this is exactly, I feel like this fits in. This is a good answer. Yes, I'm excited about this because I really feel this answer in my bones. So I am a diehard, lifelong Democrat. Okay. And I come from a long line of people like me. And I had a friend, Leah, I'm going to give another shout out to my friend Leah, who told me about a podcast called The Bulwark. And it's hosted by a lifelong conservative. And his name is Charlie Sykes. And he used to be like a conservative radio talk show host. Like, I don't know if he was like Rush Limbaugh, but he definitely like was sort of in that vein. And he is a never Trumper. And it has been, so I've been listening to his podcast now. I mean, it's 5 days a week. I don't listen every day, but I listen a lot because it has been, this is what podcasts do. They let you be a fly on the wall on some conversation that maybe you could never have and learn something. And I have to say, listening to him, and he has always conservative, people who used to be conservative, but are anti-Trump on the show. And it is a fascinating listen to hear them put into their own context and framework, to have them put it into their own framework of thinking. There are things, I can't point to a specific example, but there are moments when I've been like, I see his point about that particular issue. We agree about so much right now. I know if Biden gets elected, like I'll probably start to hate him because then he'll go back to his, staunch Republican stance on everything. But it has been totally enlightening. Very cool. I listen to lots of liberal leaning podcasts, but I don't miss his. I don't miss listening to it. I always make time for it.
Well, this is like another rabbit hole for me. This what I'm calling these new philosophers that are talking about this idea of sense making, about personal sovereignty, about having agency, and it's really interesting. There's a podcast called Future Thinkers, another one called The Stoa, which is
I haven't heard of these podcasts.
Philosophy. Fascinating stuff. And there's a guy named Daniel Schmachtenberger who, like, every time I listen to him, I'm like totally like fanboying. Like, he talks about like things from a civilizational context and this idea of mimetic tribes, which are essentially all these like little slivers, these culture wars that are happening now. Black Lives Matter, like Antifa, anarchists, the activists, the social justice activists, like the white supremacists. Like literally, he identified like 20 of them, and he calls them mimetic tribes, and everyone's just kind of like vying for like the nation's attention. So we are now more splintered than ever. But
what is the name of that's his? He wrote a book, or he has a podcast.
Well, there's a really good post on Medium called "The Mimetic Tribe War 2.0" or something. I'll send you the link.
Yeah, send me the link.
It was a fascinating read. That's Peter Limberg, who is the host of the Stoa. But these guys, Jordan Hall, Jamie Wheel, who is the co-founder of Flow Genome Project. So when you just basically like when you hear them talk, I'm just like, whoa, like they're like
it blows your mind.
Not just like book smart intelligent, but just like they've studied civilizations and how every civilization is like comes to an end. The Romans, the Greeks, the Prussians, whatever, And so is Western civilization. Like we're actually like phasing out the fact that we have these two septuagenarians running for president, like,
It's crazy.
Both of them are like on life support. It's just, and those are the only two choices we have. And like, are you kidding me? Like, there's something happening, and it's interesting. Yeah. So
I say it's funny. Like, I will just close, or at least say this about the weird world that we're living in. You and I were talking before we started recording about just what a weird place the world is in right now, and how, it's affecting everyone's lives. And all of that is true. And many days I feel like everything is horrible. But there's also, like, I also feel like this is an incredible time to be alive. Like,
oh yeah,
we are at such an interesting, like, people are always asking, like, when is another decade you'd like to be alive? And I'd want to be alive when, when they were founding the country or whatever it is. But like, I keep thinking, like, I am alive exactly when I want to be alive. Like, this is an incredible time. Lots of it is tumultuous and sorrowful and painful, but it is fascinating. And I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to be part of the generation that is experiencing this, because hopefully good will come. I mean, that's of course what we all hope.
This is a generational event. Yeah, no doubt about it.
100%.
It's interesting too. And then everyone has to decide. This is probably what we could talk about in the After Dark series. But basically, like, if you want to hear me and Skye talk about the future of the world, just tune in After Dark. But I'm just like, the people who step up. Someone said this is just a talk about social. Like, I was like, oh, I'm getting off social, screw Facebook, all of that. And then what happens is someone made a point, like, if that really happens, the only people who are left there are like the lunatics who are just talking a bunch of shit. And so
that's a good point.
You need people like with common sense to just be like, hey, that's probably not right. And that's not true. You should probably fact check that. Like, and it's so
sane voices.
You need sane voices there. So that's something to think about.
That'd be a good name for a podcast.
1 second.
Sane
Let me
voices.
Just answer this. This is the vet.
Oh, yeah.
What's the most misunderstood thing about you?
Probably the most misunderstood thing about me is that I know how to make my own podcast. Like, as I mentioned before, I've done a little bit of the work with software, but let me try to think of something. I mean, I get requests all the time from people who think that I know, like, what they're going to like in terms of podcasts. I feel like I get that wrong.
You should be like a podcast, like a tarot card reader, but for podcasts. You just be like,
I mean, that's the thing, though, is like, I'll recommend something. Like, I will go to the mat for In the Dark for someone, and they will listen to it, or they'll start, and they'll be like, this isn't my thing. Or some other podcast. And I'm also, the other thing that I just misunderstand about myself is what I'm going to like. Like, I hear what other people are recommending, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I've got to listen to that. And then I don't necessarily like it. Or I listen to something and surprise myself by then wanting to subscribe, like the podcast I mentioned a moment ago. So, I think we are all so different. And, my dad is the one real holdout on podcasts, and I cannot for the life of me figure out, like, he's someone I want to solve this problem for, and I can't figure it out. So I think that people are always like, oh, you're the podcast guru, you'll know what I like. And I get it wrong. I get it wrong. Everyone's different.
Well, make sure you get that t-shirt made, Podcast Guru, so you can wear that.
I should. I just need a sign on my head. And I walk around.
My name is Skye. Ask me to recommend a podcast to you.
Yeah. That'll be my next newsletter.
And then go to a podcasting conference.
No, it won't.
So, Skye, thank you so much. This was probably more fun than I thought it would be.
Me too. I love talking to you. Someday I'll return. I'll have you on my future, currently non-existent podcast. Yes, I would love to continue the conversation with you, Harry.
Yeah, that would be fun. And I treasure these times to connect with friends in the podcasting space. And that's why I sort of like, I now don't have time to talk to like random people, because it's like, no, I got too many friends I got to catch up with.
It has a way of taking over.
Yes.
Yeah, this was lovely. Thank you so much for having me on your show. It was real a joy. I was looking forward to it all day, and it exceeded my expectations.
I'm glad to hear that. Thank you. Yeah, I'm really a fan of what you do and how your voice supports and uplifts the podcasting community. So I want to make sure everyone knows that. Where's the best place for folks to follow the next step in your journey?
The best place is definitely Twitter. I'm there pretty regularly at Skye Pillsbury. Very simple, just my name, and hope to see people there. Always looking for fun people to connect with on Twitter.
Okay, we'll make sure all that's in the show notes. Thanks again, Skye.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks again to Skye for coming on the show. Always appreciated. Full show notes available at podcastjunkies.com/241. Intro and outro music composed by Cedar and Soil, cedarsoil.com, for his list of amazing music. Don't forget to check out our sponsor, Focusrite, and their awesome line of gear, specifically the Scarlett 2i2 Pro. Podcast production and marketing provided by Fullcast. Sign up for a free podcast brainstorm at fullcast.co/chat15. Tune in next week for my conversation with Liz Gans. She's a reporter, journalism fellow at Stanford, and she's also the product manager at Google, and she shares with us some of the new and exciting things happening there related to podcasting. If you've made it this far, you're no doubt looking for this week's retention hashtag. Let's go with Skye is the limit, hashtag Skye is the limit, and Skye is going to be spelled SKYE is the limit, and tag podcast_junkies and Skye at Skye Pillsbury, SKYEPILLSBURY. Thanks for all you do to support the show. Talk to you next week.